All right, joining us now for our economic roundtable today, political and economic analyst, also the CEO of Gladius Consulting, Raul Mas. Also joining us is Stephen Moore, the chief economist at the Heritage Foundation. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being with us today.
Pleasure.
All right, Raul, I'm going to start with you. You're there in South Florida. You're familiar with this law firm and what they've been up to. But we want to look at this in terms of what is actually illegal versus what is legal. And what you've heard from David Cameron, we know the Icelandic prime minister has resigned, but do you think David Cameron could actually be forced to resign as this is coming to light?
Look, let's be clear. Having an offshore company, having a tax shelter is not in and of itself illegal in most jurisdictions throughout the world. What is illegal is the issue of tax fraud or money laundering, basically using these companies to run illicit or criminal gains through them. And the problem is that, even though there are an awful lot of legitimate reasons why people would want to create some of these tax shelters, the truth of the matter is that, over the past 20 or 30 years, the prevalence of drug money has become so huge and so corrosive throughout just about every business environment, certainly in Latin America, that it is very difficult to sort of distinguish what is sort of the good money from the bad money, if you will. So in the case of David Cameron, which apparently is not the case, right? These are not the proceeds of illicit drug deals. This is not some sort of nefarious criminal enterprise.
Right. No one's alleging that. What his opposition in Parliament there is alleging is that he benefited, where most people don't have this opportunity. But Stephen, I want to bring you into this because you look at this question: these tax loopholes, tax shelters. Is this people doing wrong, or people perhaps, is the system what should be to blame here? Some of these legal loopholes that a lot of the politicians have alluded to, people taking advantage of this. Does this just show us how flawed the system is?
A little bit of both, but one of the big scandals I think that was revealed by this report is how many politicians are getting rich off being politicians. Where did these politicians get all this money that they can put in these offshore accounts? Many of them are involved in graft and payments. These payments, these are politicians from all over the world, sometimes third world countries. And, politics isn't something you're supposed to get rich off of, but many politicians are. I think that in terms of the United States, the lesson is, why don't we become a tax haven? Why don't we cut our taxes so low that companies want to leave here? It really ties into the big story last week that you all covered about Pfizer that was going to leave the United States, and now they've passed new regulations preventing them from leaving. But we have so many companies leaving the United States because of these high tax rates. Bring them back by cutting taxes here, and we'll create jobs in America.
Yeah, the release of these papers always kind of shined the spotlight, though, on Delaware. Raul, why is that?
Yeah, because Delaware basically provides the tax shelters domestically, right? I mean, this is nothing that is particularly unique to Panama. The Swiss sort of invented this. And a lot of Americans don't realize that up until recently, outside of the United States, there was a clear distinction made between what was tax evasion and tax fraud. So in the eyes of the Swiss for decades, they didn't see tax evasion as being a crime. They thought of it as somebody being smart as a business person to not want to pay particularly high onerous tax rates in his country and therefore shelter some of it offshore. A lot of that's changed in recent years, and tax evasion has now come under a lot of scrutiny. Tax fraud has always been illegal, but sometimes the distinctions, it's a slippery slope, and bankers and a lot of these tax havens throughout the world, whether it's Panama, Switzerland, Singapore is a big tax haven, Guernsey. There's all sorts of tax havens throughout the world, and here in the U.S., people take advantage of it as well. Like you well said, Delaware, you can open up an offshore trust, an offshore company, a private company fairly easily.
Right. I mean, they have like hundreds a day. I read like 400, right, I think, a day open up there.
Yeah, but again, the point here is that in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, this is not an illegal activity. I mean, money goes to where, and capital flow to where it's most kindly treated. And, it's true that there are these kind of tax havens all over the world. Now, there is an effort by governments around the world to basically collude and prevent these things from happening, I worry that we shift too far in the other direction. And basically, you get a kind of one world government type of system where the government of every country is overseeing your bank accounts and how you're investing your money, and that has kind of Orwellian implications as well.
Steve, as we wrap it up here, before we want to talk more about the Allergan and Pfizer deal coming up in the next segment, but do you think anything will change as a result of these Panama Papers? We're hearing about complete political implosion in Brazil, perhaps elsewhere. What do you think will be the longest lasting impact of the Panama Papers?
Yeah, I do think there's going to be, a clampdown effort on these. Again, the fraudulent. When we're talking about fraud, I'm all in favor of governments clamping down on the fraud. But again, many of these activities are legal, and my concern is they're going to try to shut down legal ways to shelter your money from the tax man.
Yeah, but I think it's going to be hard to explain to the average person who doesn't even understand how the system works. They just hear you're not paying taxes, and
guys, there's way too much money involved in this. This is not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah.
And anybody who tells you differently is, quite frankly, lying about it.
Yeah, perhaps we could hope for a better clarification, a better distinction between what is tax evasion versus what is just a loophole. And
the optics just don't look good right now.
It's getting harder all the time for governments to tax people's income. And over time, I think what you're going to see is a shift in taxation models away from income, which is so hard to get a hold of, and to tax people on what they consume. If they buy a yacht or anything, you tax that, not this income that can flow anywhere with a click of a button on a computer.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. We're going to take a look at the tax plans of the presidential candidates in light of these inversions. Some, like Donald Trump, have called them a big problem. We're going to continue to talk more with Steve Moore, Chief Economist of the Heritage Foundation, and Raul Mas, the CEO of Gladius Consulting. Newsmax Now is going to come back right after this. The Obama administration has implemented a tidal wave of new regulations, and most recently, President Obama and the Treasury Department has implemented new rules aimed at curb tax avoiding corporate inversions. And President Obama says he's pleased with what he's heard.
When companies exploit loopholes like this, it makes it harder to invest in the things that are going to keep America's economy going strong for future generations. It sticks the rest of us with the tab.
Corporate inversion is when one company merges with another from a foreign country. They move their headquarters to that country with the lower tax rate. The new Treasury rules killed a $160 billion deal between the U.S.'s biggest drug company, Pfizer, and Ireland-based Allergan. That deal would have allowed Pfizer to cut its tax bill by an estimated $1 billion a year. To move to Ireland, where tax rates are much lower, business leaders say too many regulations may end up hurting the U.S. job market. Welcome back in our roundtable. Political and economic analyst and CEO of Gladius Consulting, Raul Mas. Also back with us, Steve Moore, the chief economist at the Heritage Foundation. Gentlemen, thanks for being back with us.
Yep.
All right, Steve, you were talking about this a little bit earlier in the last segment about the only way we're really going to address some of these situations is to truly reform the tax code. Out of everyone who's left, Democrat and Republican, we'll throw the Democrats in there too, even though I don't think you're going to pick anybody on that side. Who do you think has the best tax plan, the most realistic tax plan for dealing with some of these issues?
Well, I'm a little biased because I helped write the Ted Cruz plan. So
okay, thank you for disclosing that. But of course,
so I can say Ted Cruz. I know that's going to shock you. Look, Ted Cruz has a 16% business tax. If you put in place that 16% business tax, we'll go to having one of the lowest corporate tax rates in the world from being the highest in the world now. That way, actually, companies are going to want to locate here to cut their taxes rather than to leave. And this is a big problem. I mean, the alarm bells really should be going off in Washington. When you've got companies like Pfizer, Medtronic, Burger King, Walgreens, I could go down. There's more and more of these inversions that are going to happen unless we reform the tax system.
Do you think this new Treasury Department thing that the Obama administration just put in place that has halted the Pfizer-Allergan deal, is that just a Band-Aid? Or is that going to prevent other companies from doing the same?
Well, there's an attempt to essentially create the equivalent of a regulatory Berlin Wall around the United States, which would basically say that companies can't leave if they're founded here. In other words, they're trying to say you can't leave the United States. Well, if you do that, you're going to create a system where a lot of companies, technology companies and so on, aren't going to want to be formed here in the first place. Because we've learned so many times in the past, If you don't have the right to exit, you don't enter in the first place.
Yeah.
So you heard Steve say, and you were right, he wasn't going to go with the Democratic plan.
Not surprised.
Not surprised at all.
Not Bernie Sanders' plan.
Not at all.
We
Raul,
have the full screens prepared just in case, though.
We do. We can go over all of them. Raul, who do you think has the best tax plan?
Well, listen, I mean, I'm not in disagreement. I think Ted Cruz's plan is actually one of the better ones out there. And in fact, if you look at that 16% figure that Steve alluded to, and you look at that 16, 17% tax rate is essentially what Allergen would have been paying, what they would have been paying in Ireland. And you know, when you look compared to the U.S. tax rate of 25%. The company would have saved itself about $1 billion. So part of the problem here, as Steve well alluded to, is the fact that our corporate rate structure is very, very high as compared to the rest of the world. And companies like Ireland and other places are going to try and eat our lunch and try and basically get these companies to re-domicile and capture those tax revenues as opposed to paying it to, you know, the Treasury of the United States. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, if you believe in capitalism, capitalism is all about maximizing the value of the shareholder. And so these companies are going to go where they can basically fulfill that mission.
All right, we got 2 minutes left. I want to go over Donald Trump and John Kasich's tax plans if we can real quickly. Steve, what is the biggest problem with the Kasich tax plan and the Trump tax plan?
They're both pretty good. They're much better than we have right now. And I want to say this because it's really important. You know, if we have this problem that we just identified with companies leaving the United States because of high tax rates, it's pretty darn important that we don't elect Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton president. Bernie Sanders wants to go to 50, 60, 70% tax rate. Literally, we wouldn't have any businesses left in this country in the 21st century. Every company would just leave. They go to Ireland or China and India. This is a big deal. Countries are competing on taxes, and we better get in the game.
Raul, why do you like Cruz's tax plan versus a Kasich or Donald Trump's plan?
Listen, for one thing, I quite frankly, I don't understand Donald Trump's plan. In fact, I think very few people do. You know, it seems to change from one day to the next. I don't think he's clearly, you know, laid out, you know, what exactly his plan is. And quite frankly, it might change a week from now. So, you know, I'd much rather go with a Ted Cruz who's a lot more thoughtful about it. Kasich's plan, quite frankly, I'm not that up to speed on what he exactly is proposing, particularly in the case of this inversion. But I know in all these cases, you know, the issue of what is our U.S. corporate tax rate of 25% is key. And we have to find a way to lower that to ensure that companies, you know, as Steve well mentioned, not only do they stay here, but they have the incentive to open up companies again. We are operating in a global marketplace these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very true.
If we are not competitive with the rest of the world, the business will go elsewhere.
This is very true. Raise your hand if you think we'll hear more about taxes from the candidates in the upcoming or some other scandal. I don't think so. No hands going up. Unfortunately,
I think I put my hand up.
We haven't talked enough about tax plans. We try to get in there today, but it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Raul, and with you, Steve, too. A great conversation. Hope folks are enlightened a little bit. These taxes are so important. All right, we also want you to tell us what you think about CIA Director John Brennan and his refusal to interrogate prisoners using waterboarding, even if that order comes from the next president. Reach out to us on Twitter at Newsmax Now.